Germany, huh? The powerhouse of Europe, right?
Huh.
And now they're calling a snap election. What in the world is going on over there?
Yeah, a lot of people are scratching their heads over this one.
Oh, that's what we're going to do today, try to figure it out, go deep on this whole thing.
Deep dive time.
Exactly, a deep dive. You sent us a ton of articles from Al Jazeera, Euronews, and Reuters, all about this crazy no-confidence vote that just kicked Chancellor Scholz out of office.
It's definitely a big deal. I mean, just to give you some context, in Germany's post-war history, this has only happened like 6 times.
Wow. So not very often.
Nope, not at all. Usually something like this only gets triggered by a major crisis, like a coalition completely falling apart or a total loss of faith in the country's leadership.
So a pretty dramatic situation.
Oh, for sure. And especially for a country like Germany with, well, their history stability is like super important to them. So yeah, this election is sending some serious shockwaves through the political landscape.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And the articles you sent, they really paint a picture of like some serious political intrigue going on behind the scenes. Whispers of sabotage, clashing economic visions. It's a bit of a political thriller, you know what I mean?
Does sound a little dramatic, yeah.
Yeah, so to understand what's happening now, we kind of got to rewind back to, like, November.
Okay, November.
Yeah, that's when Scholz made this, well, pretty controversial decision to fire his finance minister, Lindner.
Lindner. He was from the FDP party, right?
Right, that's one. And firing him, well, that was basically the first domino to fall.
Like, it set off a chain reaction.
Exactly. It totally shattered the governing coalition, leaving Scholz's party without a majority in the parliament.
So he was in a tough spot.
Oh, absolutely. He knew he was vulnerable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And instead of just like limping along, he basically just seemed to deliberately lose that no confidence vote.
So he could force a new election?
Yep, basically. It's a gamble, though, for sure.
You think he's hoping to, come back stronger? Like, get a fresh mandate from the people?
It's possible. But remember, Germany's economy is not exactly in great shape right now. The war in Ukraine has created a ton of uncertainty. Energy prices are through the roof, and inflation is a real problem. All of these things were already putting a ton of strain on the coalition, bringing all these fundamental disagreements about economic policy to the surface.
And the articles you sent, they really dive into those disagreements, don't they?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like Scholz, he was really pushing for massive investments in infrastructure, that classic Keynesian spend money to make money approach.
Right.
But the conservative bloc, they were totally advocating for austerity measures, spending cuts, the whole 9 yards, all to try to stabilize the economy.
So a real clash of economic ideologies.
That's it in a nutshell. And this battle, well, it's going to be front and center in these upcoming elections, no doubt. And the conservatives, led by Friedrich Merz, they're actually ahead in the polls right now.
So a conservative win is looking pretty likely.
Seems that way. And if that happens, well, it could have some pretty significant implications.
How so?
Well, Merz, he's been very vocal about his commitment to Germany's debt brake. That constitutional rule that basically limits how much the government can borrow.
Right, right.
So this could mean like actual cuts to social programs and a much more fiscally conservative approach overall, and that could have a real impact on Germany's role within the European Union too.
So this is about way more than just who sits in the chancellor's office.
Oh, absolutely. It's about Germany's future, its direction, its role in the world.
And we can't forget, it's not just a two-way race here either. We've got to talk about, the elephant in the room, the AfD.
The far-right party, yeah.
Exactly. The polls are showing a pretty big surge in support for them, which, to be honest, is kind of concerning.
Yeah, the AfD's rise, it's a pretty significant development in German politics. Like, the mainstream parters have basically all said they won't form a coalition with them, because of their extreme right-wing policies.
Right.
But they're getting more and more popular, which makes them harder and harder to ignore, you know what I mean? And honestly, their presence in parliament could make forming a stable government really, really tricky.
It's like a coalition conundrum, isn't it?
Exactly. And their views, especially their stance on migration, well, that sparked a lot of debate. One of the Reuters articles you sent, it actually highlights some pretty controversial comments from their leader, Alice Weidel.
Weidel, yeah. I remember that.
Well, she's been calling for the immediate return of all Syrian refugees, like right away back to Syria.
Oh.
Yeah. And she even went so far as to call them Islamist terrorists, which is, a pretty dangerous generalization.
Right.
And this kind of rhetoric, well, it plays on people's anxieties about national identity. It taps into this broader debate happening all across Europe about migration, asylum policies, and how to integrate people from different cultures.
So it feels like this election is about more than just, who gets to be chancellor. It's about the very soul of Germany and its place in the world.
That's exactly it. This election is going to determine Germany's course at a pretty pivotal moment in history. Domestically, it's going to show how Germans are dealing with economic challenges and social change. And internationally, it's going to impact Germany's role in the EU and on the global stage. It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. And speaking of unpacking, I'm kind of curious to hear more about the AfD's policy specifically. They're clearly gaining traction, but what are they actually promising voters?
It's a good question. I mean, it's crucial to understand what's fueling their rise. Beyond the inflammatory rhetoric, what are their actual economic proposals? What are their stances on social issues? Let's take a closer look at their platform and see what's resonating with voters.
Okay, let's do that. You brought some interesting research about their platform, right?
I did, actually. It's pretty fascinating stuff. So the AfD, they're a pretty complex phenomenon. Their platform, it goes way beyond just that anti-immigration stuff, the stuff that always grabs the headlines.
Right.
Like if we look at their economic policies, for example.
Okay, their economic policies.
They're really pushing for tax cuts, especially for families and small businesses.
Interesting.
Yeah. And they're also super critical of the euro.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they actually want to go back to the Deutschmark. They say it'd give Germany way more control over their economy.
So kind of like appealing to that nostalgia for a stronger currency.
That's a big part of it. They basically think Germany's carrying too much weight in the EU, and that going back to their own currency would be better for them.
But wouldn't that, totally disrupt the EU and potentially hurt trade?
That's the debate, right? I mean, critics say it would lead to a ton of economic instability and make Germany more isolated, but the AfD, they think it'd be beneficial.
Okay. So what about their social policies? The articles mentioned they're not really big on same-sex marriage, right? They're more into those traditional family values.
You got it. Socially, they're very conservative.
Yeah.
They appeal to those voters who feel like those traditional values are under attack.
Yeah.
And they're also pretty critical of what they call excessive political correctness. They see themselves as the voice of the people who feel silenced by the mainstream.
Interesting. So they're tapping into a sense of frustration, disillusionment with the way things are.
Absolutely. They present themselves as the alternative to the establishment, the voice for the people who've been forgotten. It's a strategy that's worked in other countries, where these populist movements gain traction by playing on people's fears and anxieties.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
And it's really resonating with voters who feel left behind by globalization and the rapid pace of social change.
Okay, so the AfD is kind of this mix of economic populism, social conservatism, and a good dose of anti-establishment sentiment, I guess.
That pretty much sums it up. And it's
Yeah.
a pretty potent mix, especially with all this economic uncertainty floating around. And their success, well, it really highlights this growing divide in German society. There's a whole segment of the population that feels like they're not being heard, disenfranchised and, well, increasingly drawn to the AfD's message.
That makes sense. So let's circle back to those potential scenarios for this election. You said a conservative win is the most likely, right? But with the AfD gaining ground, could they actually be a kingmaker?
It's possible, I guess, but it's really unlikely, given how much the other parties don't want to work with them.
Right.
But even with that, their strong presence, it could force the mainstream parties to compromise, Maybe even shift their policies a bit more to the right, try to win back those voters leaning towards the AfD.
So they could have an impact even if they don't actually win.
Exactly. And hey, let's not forget that Scholz is still in charge right now, as caretaker chancellor.
Right, he's not totally out of the picture.
Not yet. The articles mention that he's actually trying to push through some pretty big legislation before the election. Well, he's proposing a big tax cut, and he wants to increase child benefits.
Sounds like a classic pre-election tactic, right?
Probably.
Yeah.
He's trying to show voters he gets their concerns about the cost of living and all that.
Right.
But it's a bit risky, too, because it could increase the government's debt, and that could actually help the conservatives, who are all about fiscal responsibility and keeping that debt down.
So Scholz has got a tough balancing act ahead of him, trying to appeal to voters without, upsetting his potential coalition partners.
You got it. It's a delicate situation for sure.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the internal politics of this election, but what about the international implications? Germany is a major player in the EU and on the global stage. How could all these changes impact their role abroad?
That's a really important question. I mean, Germany has been seen as this stabilizing force in Europe,
Yeah.
right? A champion of multilateralism, a key partner for countries like the US. So a shift to the right, especially with a stronger AfD presence, well, that could lead to a more inward-looking Germany. It could weaken the EU and potentially even mess with transatlantic relations.
Yeah, that would be a pretty big shift. And one of the articles from Euronews, it pointed out that Germany's economic problems are partly because they relied so much on Russian energy.
Yep.
So a new government might have to completely rethink their energy policies, right?
For sure. And that could have a ripple effect across all of Europe.
Yeah, it's all connected.
And with the war in Ukraine still going on, Germany's role in supporting Ukraine is really important, providing aid, that kind of thing. A new government might take a different approach, which could really shift the balance of power in that conflict.
It could, yeah. And we can't forget about the global economic situation either. Inflation's up everywhere, supply chains are still messed up, and there's a lot of uncertainty about the future. So a political shakeup in Germany, one of the world's biggest economies, that could have massive consequences for global trade and financial markets.
You're absolutely right. The whole world is watching this election. It's not just about Germany anymore. It's about the future of Europe and the global order.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is, doesn't it?
It really does. What happens in one country, even a country as powerful as Germany, can have huge ripple effects around the world.
Wow, this is a lot to process. You've really done a great job laying it all out, though. I think what's really striking to me is how Germany, they've always been like this symbol of stability, right? Consensus building, all that. And now they're dealing with such a fractured political landscape.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a big change.
It feels like we're witnessing a historical shift or something.
It does kind of feel like a turning point. And it just shows, I think, that even in these really stable democracies, things can change really fast, especially when you throw in economic anxieties, social divisions, and all the global uncertainty we're facing.
Right, right. So as we get closer to these elections in February, what should people be watching for? What are the key things that could tell us which way things are going?
Well, I'd say keep an eye on the economic data for sure. Inflation, unemployment, how much the economy is growing, GDP, those things are going to be huge for voters.
It makes sense.
And pay attention to the campaigns, too. What are they focusing on? Are they talking about the economy, social issues, national identity? The messaging will give you a good sense of what's resonating with people, what they care about.
Right. And beyond those main parties, should we be watching the smaller ones, too?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The Greens, the Left Party, those guys could end up being super important. Their willingness to compromise, their demands, it's all going to shape the new government, whoever ends up in charge.
It will, yeah. Well, this has been a really, really insightful deep dive. I feel like I understand this whole thing a lot better now. What about you? What were some of the things that really jumped out to you from all those articles?
I think for me, the biggest takeaway is just how divided German society is right now. It's pretty deep. And the rise of the AfD, it's not just about them. It's a symptom of something bigger, I think. This feeling of disillusionment, resentment, all that. It's fueling this whole political polarization we're seeing.
Yeah, and it's not just in Germany, is it?
No, not at all. We're seeing this kind of thing pop up all over the world. It feels like we're moving into this era of politics where everything's more fragmented, more volatile. It's hard to predict what's going to happen next.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So much to think about. As we wrap up here, I want to leave our listeners with one last question, something to really chew on. All this happening in Germany, the war in Ukraine, and everything else going on globally. How much power does a country, even a powerful country like Germany, actually have to control its own fate?
That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, in this world, everything's connected, right? Domestic politics, international affairs, it's all tangled up together. Germany's future, it's tied to what happens in Brussels and Moscow, Washington, Beijing, everywhere. It's this web of interdependence,
Yeah.
And it shows how important it is to understand what's happening globally when we're trying to understand what's going on in a single country.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It reminds us that we're all part of this bigger story, right? And the choices we make individually and collectively, they have consequences that reach way beyond our own little corners of the world. It's It's both powerful and kind of scary, this whole being interconnected thing.
I know what you mean. It's a lot, and that's why I think it's so important to stay informed, to stay engaged, and to really think critically about all these complicated issues.
Well said. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into German politics, everyone. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking. And remember, stay curious out there.